Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The ceasefire along Israel's Lebanese border has been holding since late November. A few days after its inception, the Assad regime collapsed, and with it, the Syrian military threat to Israel. Turkey has no common boundary with Israel, and its forces are relatively far away. A superficial look would thus give the impression that all is quiet on Israel's northern front. However, on close inspection, one can see how fragile this quiet really is, with hostile moves occurring in all sectors and Israeli strikes being deployed to destroy and deter any and all emerging threats. The situation is potentially explosive, enough for President Donald Trump to publicly offer his good services to both Erdogan and Netanyahu. Joining us to dissect these matters are, from Washington, D.C., retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, who formerly served as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. It's good to see you, General.
Good to see you, Jonathan.
Also joining us from elsewhere here in Israel is Dr. Nir Bohms, who is a project manager at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. It's good to see you as well, Nir.
Good to be here.
Always a pleasure indeed. Mr. Amil, our TV7 editor-at-large, take it away.
So, as you said, what is happening in Israel's northern border, northern front, is fragile, could erupt any minute. And it seems as if Israel has reverted to its pre-October 7th method of the so-called campaign between the wars. There are focused operations, especially against key operatives, either of Hezbollah trying to improve their positions in case the ceasefire breaks, or against Palestinian operatives such as Hamas leaders operating from Lebanon, because Hamas has never agreed to stop its activities outside of Gaza, even when the ceasefire held within Gaza. In Syria, the Israeli Air Force has acted both against targets belonging to the Ancien Regime, to the Assad regime, which is no longer there, but there are assets which could be used by hostile forces, and especially against those facilities which could help the Turkish forces should they go south to the Damascus area or to old Syrian Air Force bases. Now, even if there is, let's say, a Turkish brigade not too far from the Israeli border, this in itself would not threaten Israel. Based on the ratio of forces, but it could become a tripwire, which Israel would hesitate to put its foot on, because this could generate a full-scale conflict with Turkey, which is why it's so delicate and why American mediation, the good offices of good services of President Trump, could be necessary here.
Absolutely. A tripwire is an understatement, but nonetheless, at this point in time, both Israel and Turkey are very clear-eyed about it, at least not in the public maybe, but yes, behind closed doors with regard to their efforts to avoid such a confrontation. Naturally, that was subsequently also voiced by Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan of Turkey, that he said explicitly that he's not interested in a confrontation with Israel. And on the other hand, also Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar said the same from an Israeli perspective, something that needs to be taken in all seriousness, but nonetheless, miscalculation can occur with regard to your mention about the campaign between the wars. In Israel, they used to call it the Ma'aracha ben Milchamot, or Mabam, as its abbreviation, is true to a certain degree, of course, in a different nature. Today, it's more about enforcement of the ceasefire in Lebanon, particularly, and the red lines in Syria, but also
degrading the other side's assets for them to have less should the war
Absolutely. As part of the preemption, basically, protocols. But on that, let's separate the two theaters for one moment and start with the Lebanese file. Looking at Lebanon today, we'll start with you, General Kimmett. What should we take out of that theater?
Well, I think the first thing we ought to take out from that theater is the surprising tranquility that we're seeing at this point. I, for one, am surprised to see that Hezbollah has not tried to, even through demonstration, if nothing else, demonstrate to their own people that they are still an active and potent military force. I'm surprised they seem to be, in general, adhering to the ceasefire, and that the forces below the Litani River are not being active. Now, this is early in the day. The question is, will Hezbollah be like the grass and need mowing again in the future? Don't know. But the one surprising thing for me is the relative calm that we're seeing in that area right now.
Well, there are still ongoing strikes against Hezbollah targets as part of the enforcement of the Israeli Air Force. And there is, of course, the joint French-American mechanism at play to ensure that nothing gets out of hand. But nonetheless, Dr. Bohms, your take on the Lebanese theater from your lens?
Well, Lebanon is a country of opportunities. I think it's also now useful to say that. We are looking at a political transition, at the weakening Hezbollah, and at attempts by some of the allies of Israel to create a new reality there. And this new reality, the new status quo, and I think we'll speak more about this when it comes to Syria, is about the fact that Israel is saying it's not going to allow forces that are contrary and that aligned with Hezbollah and the remaining of the Iranian axis, or some of the new Islamists that tries to make their way in from the Sunni axis, to again set foot in Lebanon, then also in Syria. And this new idea of the status quo is that on the one hand, we're not going to let these forces get a base in Lebanon and in Syria. And on the other hand, there may be a way to put a hand, to give a hand to the more pragmatic forces who would like to see this stability from their perspective, and that will be able to get the additional political capital in order to stabilize this situation and further weaken these more radical forces and really create a different status quo in the region. That's the broader strategic aim. And everything we're seeing around has to do with how to potentially achieve this and how to maneuver between the forces. Should we empower particular groups? Should we empower minorities? Is there a way to empower a new government, whether it is in Lebanon and later on in Syria, which is tricky because of some of the components of these governments that are not necessarily in agreement to the more pragmatic line that I'm suggesting here. And that's the wiggling that we're seeing that is also expressed kinetically. On the one hand, dealing with the threats and making sure they're going to continue to be weakened. And on the other hand, working politically to strengthen forces that perhaps in the long term can help create a new political reality in the region at large.
Mr. Owen?
Yes, this is probably going to be tested quite soon. We don't know whether al-Julani will stay in power, whether retired General Joseph Aoun will be able to consolidate his power in Beirut. Obviously, in Egypt, President Assisi was quite concerned with the ability of al-Julani and his cohort to topple Assad, should others get these ideas and try to import them into Egypt. So we are in a flux, and while it is not really a part of that discussion, the end of the Gaza war should placate the area and perhaps bring resolution to Lebanon and Syria.
Well, it will be a factor, I'm sure, but there are too many problems in Syria and in Lebanon for it to have a decisive effect. And on that, General Kimmett, when we're talking about Hezbollah, you mentioned that it still is somewhat of a potent force, and that you're surprised that it does not try and project that, at least domestically. The fact that it failed after, at least because turning into a so-called headless chicken, where much of its command and control has been fully eradicated, it still had a very potent, roughly, according to estimates, 15,000 strong militants capable of operating. That is not enough, of course, to project power outside, since it lost much of its strategic weaponry, but it still has a lot to from that perspective. It still has a lot to be able to project domestically in Lebanon. How do you see the United States and France, for that, unite in order to somehow mitigate still that Hezbollah influence in Lebanon, despite that very potent force that could pose a challenge?
Well, what you're referring to is the Hezbollah militants, but the Hezbollah politicians, of course, are still embedded in the Lebanese government as what is seen as a legitimate political party. They have not lost a significant amount of potency and power inside the political scene inside of Lebanon, inside of Beirut. So they're going to be around for a while. And because of that, they can use that presence to continue to portray themselves as a resistance force. And in many ways, what that'll allow is not necessarily a rebirth, but a reconstitution of the Hezbollah forces. But the most important thing, a term that we've been using since October 7th, is the need to reestablish deterrence. And if there is any country which at this point has had deterrence reestablished by the Israeli Defense Forces, I believe it's Lebanon, and by extension, Hezbollah.
Dr. Bombs, is that also your view?
Yes, I'll agree with the caveats that this deterrence is not something that has been very effective when it comes to the Iranian proxies. We've seen that the Houthis in Yemen are very far from accepting the doctrine of deterrence. And it seems that the motivation of Hezbollah, while it certainly is influenced, because Hezbollah is still a political player in Lebanon by the war and certainly by their casualties, it's not that the motivation is stopped. We've just heard of other reports about Iranian humanitarian assistance trucks that had weapons and ammunition that were able to again find their way through the Iraqi and then Syrian crossing points, all the way to Syria and then to Lebanon. And that's in a way the same old, which means that deterrence is not going to cut it completely. The real solution, if there is one, again, is a combination not of just kinetic activities from the air or from the ground, but also the ability to find allies on the ground in Syria and in Lebanon that would want to help weaken these players. And there are players as such. There are those who would like to see further weakening of the Iranian axis. They need to be empowered. They need to get more support so that operation will eventually be completed. Deterrence alone is not going to cut it.
If I may just add to that, there is a breakthrough in Syrian-Lebanese relations, the demarcation of the border between the two countries, which the Syrians resisted because historically they have seen Lebanon as part of their own...
under the Saudi auspices.
Yes. Now, if I may use a metaphor, the Iranians on whom the Assad regime depended impregnated Syria, and what we had was Rosemary's Baby, Hezbollah, and a monster, really. And at one time, after the Arab Spring, Hezbollah was even stronger than Syria, again, as part of the Iranian axis. Now, even though the talks themselves on the points of contention in the border, and we will get to the so-called Shaba farms, and then perhaps Israel will have to decide what it does about it, whether it is going to negotiate with Lebanon or with Syria. Now there is progress. If there are separations of sort between Lebanon and Syria, Israel can handle either of them much more easily.
With that being said, of course, there are also tensions between Lebanon and
Yes.
Syria on multiple issues. Syria has yet to establish an embassy in Beirut for various reasons, one of which you mentioned earlier. It still views Lebanon as part of Greater Syria, and therefore it does not want to grant it all of the legitimacy. But indeed, establishing that specific border to appease, even if only to appease the Saudis, is already one very significant step in the right direction from that perspective. But General Kimmett, let's talk for a moment about Syria, since what Dr. Bums mentioned about the capacity to still smuggle munitions from Iran through Iraq and Syria into Lebanon is indicative of the fact that the HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which managed to take over Damascus, not by establishing a lot of battles, but by the loss of control of the Assad regime in light of the vacuum that emerged in Lebanon in the war with Israel, it really has not enough forces to consolidate its power over the entirety of Syrian territory, which still allows bad actors such as the Islamic Republic's Revolutionary Guards to exploit locals in order to conduct various illicit transfers and smuggling of munition.
Yeah, first of all, I think everyone must understand that you say we need to do more than deterrence, but candidly, one has to ask if deterrence, a restoration of deterrence, is the best that can be expected as long as there remain pervasive ideological divisions between those elements on the ground, in the sense of, I mean, without, much like Iran that doesn't have a role, the theocracy doesn't have a role if they're not at revolution. I mean, what is the purpose of Hezbollah and Hamas if they're not resistance organizations? Now, that may, back to your point about the smuggling of weapons across Syria, that may be indicative of the fact that Jelani doesn't have the capabilities you say. And in many ways, one would find it surprising that a ideological Sunni organization is willing to allow an ideological Shia organization to continue to transport weapons and equipment across their boundary. More than likely, that's an issue of a lack of capacity. And frankly, I think that's one of the issues that the U.S. military is talking about in terms of being able to provide specific and limited intelligence support to Jelani to go after those exact shipments that he, of all people, would not want to be seeing coming across his border and through his country to support ideological enemies of his in Lebanon and perhaps Gaza.
Dr. Bombs?
Well, just a few days ago, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons put an interesting report about an estimate based on interviews with Syrian scientists who defected, and that was a recent one, about 100 military sites that's connected to chemical weapons in Syria. Previously, the report was about 27 of those, and Assad has been using chemical weapons reportedly until 2018, and apparently continued to create these types of capabilities. And some of these capabilities were recently destroyed with the Israeli actions following December 7th. This is part, I think, of the broader context of understanding the challenge. There are negative players, there are radical players, and it's important to make sure that capabilities are not going to be in their hands. I very much agree with the general that We cannot fight an ideological line just with kinetic actions. That's not going to work. So you really need to make sure there's not going to be capabilities to create and cause significant harm. And then, as I've said before, to look at the other direction of how to create the right political environment that may be able to provide the answers that we need for stability in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Booms. Mr. Owen?
Various countries take pride in inventing or discovering various discoveries or inventions which later all of mankind enjoyed. Syria's claim to fame is that it originated the military coup in the Middle East in 1949. This was the very first coup by Hosni Zaim, and then it was emulated by the Egyptians and many others. And up until...
That wasn't the last one in Syria
No,
either.
of course not. It was a series of coups, and up until Hafez Assad in 1970, it was a series of coups, and the Assad regime managed to suppress all uprisings, real or imaginary, by military forces. We have to see now with Ahmed Ashara whether he will be lax enough to allow some military force to emerge to threaten his regime.
Well, the Assad regime, let's put this in context for our viewers' sake, utilized murderous
Of course.
atrocities in order to suppress
It
his
learned the
opponents.
lessons of its predecessor.
And naturally, those activities are not strange to the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, from which al-Julani emerged. So,
but then it will not get Western aid.
right, but we still have to put things into context, but that is an important leverage, and therefore short-term objectives of Ashara, so-called, is indeed something to take into account. General Kimmett, let's put another actor within this context, Operation Inherent Resolve, a U.S. Central Command operation against al-Qaeda with advisors in Iraq as well as special operators in Syria. Naturally, the Trump administration, President Trump himself, his vice president, and many within his administration have not shied away from mentioning their aspirations to disengage from Syria proper. But nonetheless, the Islamic State is a very dangerous actor to leave unchecked. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there have been no final decisions made about Operation Inherent Resolve, except to the extent that they will not be able to operate in Iraq proper after a certain period of time in 2026. I believe it's in September. There's still some outstanding questions about if they'll be able to operate out of northern Iraq, what some would call the Kurdistan region. That's yet to be seen, and I think it's going to be candidly threat dependent. If al-Shara can be relied on to conduct his own operations against ISIS and keep them under his thumb, then there will be less of an excuse that the Americans will be able to use to keep those forces in northern Syria. I think we both know the outcome of that. So the real issue is if they're not in Kurdistan and they're not in Iraq, then you have the problem that al-Julani is asking all foreign forces to leave. Now that's would affect OIR, but in that matter, it would also affect the Turks. So we'll have to see how that goes. Nonetheless, the United States, it has a convenient location in northern Syria to be able to conduct those anti-ISIS operations. But they do have other locations in the Middle East where they can support operations as well. So we'll have to see. It's clear that the YPG, the Kurdish forces in northern Syria, want to continue the fight against ISIS. They see them as a threat and have seen them as a threat from day one. So it will be a modified mission. It won't be as easy to conduct the counter-ISIS mission from other locations in the region. It may well be that as the YPG has now said that they will merge into al-Shara's forces, that will be more difficult. But I think the United States is going to hold al-Shara to the condition that if you're unwilling to take on ISIS, then we're going to continue to do it ourselves.
And the detention of thousands of ISIS fighters, you can't just leave them without God.
No, that is true, but again, that's part of the deal with the YPG, with the Kurds and the Iraqis. There's a lot of work being done to empty out a hole, but you're right. That's another one of the pressure points that we have on al-Shara, and for that matter, Muslim Abdi and his forces. We've done a lot for them over the years. They fought alongside of us. We fought alongside of them. But any notion that they will just quit guarding the prison camps that have those ISIS families and ISIS fighters in them, that just won't happen.
Which is an army of roughly 40,000 strong, and that is something to be taken into account, maybe a bit less of that. But nonetheless, the fact that needs to be taken into account, and I'm sure that the United States has this in the back of its head, if not in the forefront of its understanding, that al-Shara or al-Julani and those Islamic states incarcerated in those prisons or in those camps are of the same ideology. So that is something that can always be exploited in one way or another. Another point that needs to be taken into account is that if al-Julani asks all foreign forces to leave, he might as well also disband his own HTS organization, which is made up of many foreign forces, including his own so-called administrative government and so on. But Dr. Bombs, one sentence from you for closing.
Well, President al-Shara needs to maneuver between a number of factors and foreign pressure points. The only way to maintain Syria as Syria for him is to maneuver it correctly. And therefore, there is a chance that if this is done correctly, something positive can happen. And at the same token, it's enough for one or two mistakes or miscalculations to have this entire very fragile structure to just simply collapse.
Dr. Bombs, General Kimmett, Mr. Owen, thank you so very much for all of your insights. I'd like to also thank all of you at home as well. Till our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.